Chapter 5. The People of the Drama. "Have you seen all you want of the study?" asked White Mason as we re-entered the house. "For the time," said the inspector, and Sherlock Holmes nodded. "Then perhaps you would like to hear how the evidence of some of the people in the house. We could use the dining room. Please come yourself first and tell us all you know." The butler's account was a simple and clear one, and he gave a convincing impression of sincerity. He had been engaged 5 years ago when Mr. Douglas first came to Burlstone. He understood that Mr. Douglas was a rich gentleman who had made his money in America. He had been a kind and considerate employer, not quite what Ames was used to, perhaps, but one can't have everything. He never saw any signs of apprehension in Mr. Douglas. On the contrary, he was the most fearless man he had ever known. He ordered the drawbridge to be pulled up every night because it was an ancient custom of the old house, and he liked to keep up the old ways. Mr. Douglas seldom went to London or left the village, but on the day before the crime he had been shopping in Tunbridge Wells. Ames had observed some restlessness and excitement on the part of Mr. Douglas upon that day, for he had seemed impatient and irritable, which was unusual for him. He had not gone to bed that night, but was in the pantry at the back of the house, putting away the silver, when he heard the bell ring violently. He heard no shot, but it was hardly possible he should, as the pantry and the kitchens were at the very back of the house, and there are several closed doors and a long passage between. The housekeeper had come out of her room, attracted by the violent ringing of the bell. They had gone in front of the house together. As they reached the bottom of the stair, he had seen Mrs. Douglas coming down it. No, she was not hurrying. It did not seem to him that she was particularly agitated. Just as she reached the bottom of the stair, Mr. Barker had rushed out of the study. He had dropped Mrs. Douglas and begged her not to go back. "For God's sake, go back to your room," he cried. "Poor Jack is dead. You can do nothing. For God's sake, go back." After some persuasion upon the stairs, Mrs. Douglas had gone back. She did not scream. She made no outcry whatsoever. Mrs. Allen, the housekeeper, had taken her upstairs and stayed with her in the bedroom. Ames and Mr. Barker had then returned to the study, where they found everything exactly as the police had seen it. The candle was not lit at the time, but the lamp was burning. They had looked out the window, but the night was very dark and nothing could be seen or heard. They had then rushed into the hall, where Ames had turned the windlass which had lowered the drawbridge. Mr. Barker had then hurried off to get the police. Such, in its essentials, was the evidence of the butler. The account of Mrs. Allen, the housekeeper, was, so far as it went, a corroboration of that of her fellow servant. The housekeeper's room was rather nearer to the front of the house than the pantry in which Ames had been working. She had prepared to go to bed when the loud ringing of the bell had attracted her attention. She was a little hard of hearing. Perhaps that was why she had not heard the sound of the shot, but in any case the study was a long way off. She remembered hearing some sound which she imagined to be the slamming of a door. That was a good deal earlier, half an hour at least before the ringing of the bell, when Mr. Ames ran to the front of the house with him. She saw Mr. Barker, very pale and excited, come out of the study. He intercepted Mrs. Douglas, who was coming down the stairs. He entreated her to go back, and she answered him, but what she said could not be heard. "Take her up and stay with her," he had said to Mrs. Allen. She had therefore taken her to the bedroom and endeavored to soothe her. She was greatly excited, trembling all over, but made no other attempt to go downstairs. She had just sat in her dressing gown in the bedroom fire with her head sunk in her hands. Mrs. Allen stayed with her most of the night. As to the other servants, they had all gone to bed, and the alarm did not reach them until after and just before the police arrived. that slept at the extreme back of the house and could not possibly have heard anything. So far, the housekeeper, who could add nothing as a cross-examination save lamentations and expressions of amazement. Mr. Cecil Barker succeeded Mrs. Allen as a witness. As to the occurrences of the night before, they had very little to add to what had already been told to the police. Personally, he was convinced that the murderer had escaped by the window. The bloodstain was conclusive, in his opinion, upon that point. Besides, as the bridge was up, there was no other possible way of escaping. He could not explain what had become of the assassin, or why he had not taken his bicycle, if it were indeed his. He could not have possibly been drowned in the moat, which at no place is more than 3 feet deep. In his own mind, he had a very definitive theory about the murder. Douglas was a reticent man, and there were some chapters of his life of which he had never spoken. He had emigrated to America from Ireland when he was a very young man. He had prospered well, and when Barker had first met him in California, where they had become partners in a successful mining claim at the place called Benito Canyon. They had done very well, but Douglas had suddenly sold out and started for England. He was a widower at that time. Barker had afterwards realized his money had come to live in London. Thus they renewed their friendship. Douglas had given him the impression that some danger was hanging over his head, and he had always looked upon his sudden departure from California, and also his renting a house in so quiet a place in England, as being connected with the peril. He imagined that some secret society, some implacable organization was on Douglas's track which would never rest until it killed him. Some remarks of his had given him the idea, though he had never told him what the society was, nor how he had come to offend it. He could only suppose that the legend upon the placard had some reference to the secret society. "How long were you with Douglas in California?" asked Inspector MacDonald. 5 years altogether. Was he a bachelor, you say? A widower. Have you ever heard of his first wife and where she came from? No, I remember her saying that she was of Swedish extraction, and I have seen her portrait. She was a very beautiful woman, and died of typhoid the year before I met him. You don't associate his past with any particular part of America. I've heard him talk of Chicago. He knew that city well and had worked there. I've heard him talk of the coal and the iron districts. He had traveled a good deal in his time. Was he a politician? Had the secret society to do with politics? No, he cared nothing about politics. You have no reason to think it was criminal? On the contrary, I've never met a straighter man in my life. Was there anything curious in his life in California? He liked best to stay out and to work on our claim in the mountains. He would never go where other men were if he could help it. That's why I first thought if someone was after him. Then he left so suddenly for Europe, I made sure that it was so. I believe that he had a warning of some sort. Within a week of his leaving, 6 men were inquiring for him. What sort of men? Well, they were a mighty hard-looking crowd. They came up to the claim and wanted to know where he was. I told them that he had gone to Europe and that I did not know where to find him. They meant him no good. It was easy to see that. Were these men Americans? Californians? Oh, I don't know about Californians. They were Americans, all right. But they were not miners. I don't know what they were, and was very glad to see their backs. And that was 6 years ago? And here 7. And then you were together 5 years in California, so that this business dates back not less than 11 years at the least? That is so. There must be a very serious few that would have kept up with such earnestness for as long as that. It would not be a light thing that would give rise to it. I think it shadowed his whole life. It was never quite out of his mind. But if a man had a danger hanging over him and knew that it was, don't you think he would turn to the police for protection? Maybe there was some danger that he could not be protected against. There's one thing you should know. He always went about armed. His revolver was never out of his pocket, but by bad luck he was in his dressing gown and had left it in the bedroom last night. Once the bridge was up, I guess he thought he was safe. I should like these dates a little clearer, said MacDonald. It is quite 6 years since Douglas left California. You followed him the next year, did you not? That is so. And he has been married 5 years. You must have returned about the time of his marriage. About a month before. How was his best man? Did you know Mrs. Douglas before her marriage? No, I did not. I've been away from England for 10 years. But you have seen a good deal of her since. Barker looked sternly at the detective. I've seen a good deal of him since, he answered. If I have seen her, it is not because you cannot visit a man without knowing his wife. If you can imagine that there was any connection... I imagine nothing, Mr. Barker. I'm bound to make every inquiry which can bear some on the case, but I meant no offense. Some inquiries are offensive, Barker answered angrily. It's only the facts that we want. It is in your interest and everyone's interest that they should be cleared up. Did Mr. Douglas entirely approve of your friendship with his wife? Barker grew paler, and his great strong hands were clasped convulsively together. You have no right to ask such questions, he cried. What does this have to do with the matter you're investigating? I must repeat the question. Well, I refuse to answer. You can refuse to answer, but you must be aware that your refusal in itself is an answer. For you'd not to refuse if you had not something to conceal. Barker stood for a moment, with his face set grimly and his strong black eyebrows drawn low in intense thought. Then he looked up with a smile. Well, I guess you gentlemen are only doing your duty. After all, and I have no right to stand in your way of it. I'd only ask you not to worry Mrs. Douglas over the matter, for she has enough on her just now. I may tell you that poor Douglas had one fault in the world, and that was his jealousy. He was fond of me, no man could be fonder of a friend, and he was devoted to his wife. He loved me to come here and was forever sending for me. And yet, if his wife and I talked together, there seems any sympathy between us, a kind of wave of jealousy would pass over him, and he would be off the handle and saying the wildest things in a moment. More than once I have sworn off coming for that reason, and then he would write me such penitent, imploring letters that I just had to. But you can take it from me, gentlemen, as if it is my last word, that no man has ever had a more loving, faithful wife, and I say also no friend could be more loyal than I am. It was spoken with a fervor and feeling, and yet Inspector MacDonald could not dismiss the subject. You are aware, he said, that the dead man's wedding ring had been taken off of his finger. So it appears, said Barker. What do you mean by appears? You know it's a fact. The man seemed confused and undecided. When I said it appears, I meant that it was conceivable that he had himself taken off the ring. The mere fact that the ring should be absent, whoever may have removed it, would suggest to anyone's mind, would it not, that the marriage and the tragedy were connected? Barker shrugged his broad shoulders. I can't profess to say what it suggests, he answered. But if you mean to hint that it could reflect in any way upon his lady's honor... His eyes blazed for an instant, and then with an evident effort he got a grip down on his emotions. Well, you are on the wrong track, that's all. I don't know that I've anything else to ask you at present, said MacDonald coldly. There was one small point, remarked Sherlock Holmes. When you entered the room, there was only the candle lighted upon the table, was there not? Yes, that was so. By its light you saw some terrible incident had occurred. Exactly. You at once rang for help. Yes, and it arrived very speedily, within a minute or so. And yet, when they arrived, they found that the candle was out and the lamp had been lighted. That seems very remarkable. Again, Barker showed some signs of indecision. I don't see that is remarkable, Mr. Holmes, he answered after a pause. The candle threw a very bad light. My first thought was to get a better one. The lamp was on the table, so I lit it. And blew out the candle. Exactly. Holmes had no further question, and Barker had a deliberate look from one to the other of us, which had, as it seemed to me, something of defiance in it. Turned and then left the room. Inspector MacDonald had sent up a note to the effect that he would wait upon Mrs. Douglas in her room, but she had replied that she would meet us in the dining room. She entered now, a tall, beautiful woman of 30, reserved and self-possessed to a remarkable degree, very different from the tragic and distracted figure that I had pictured. It is true that her face was pale and drawn, like that of one who had endured a great shock, but her manner was composed, and the finely molded hand with which she rested upon the edge of the table was as steady as my own. Her sad, appealing eyes traveled from one to the other of us with a curious, inquisitive expression. That questioning gaze transformed itself suddenly into an abrupt speech. "Have you found everything out yet?" she asked. Was it my imagining that there was an undertone of fear rather than of hope in that question? "We have taken every possible step, Mrs. Douglas," said the inspector. "You may rest assured that nothing will be neglected." "Spare no money," she said in a dead, even tone. "It is my desire that every possible effort should be made." "Perhaps you can tell us something which may throw some light upon the matter." "I fear not, but all I know is at your service." "We have heard from Mr. Cecil Barker that you did not actually see, that you were never in the room where the tragedy occurred." "No. He turned me back upon the stairs. He begged me not to enter. He begged me to return to my room." "Quite so. You had heard the shot, and you had at once come down?" "I put on my dressing gown and then came down." "How long after was it, hearing the shot, that you were stopped on the stair by Mr. Barker?"
It had been a couple of minutes. It was so hard to reckon time at such a moment. He implored me not to go on. He assured me that I could do nothing. Then Mrs. Allen, the housekeeper, led me upstairs again. It was all like some dreadful dream."
"Can you give us any idea how long your husband had been downstairs before you heard the shot?"
"No, I cannot say. He went from his dressing room, and I did not hear him go. He did the round of the house every night, for he was nervous of fire. It is the only thing that I have ever known him to be nervous of."
"That is the point which I came to, Mrs. Douglas. You have only known your husband in England, have you not?"
"Yes. We've been married 5 years."
"Have you heard him speak of anything which occurred in America, and which might bring some danger upon him?" Mrs. Douglas thought earnestly before she answered.
Yes, she said at last.
I've always felt that there was a danger hanging over him. He refused to discuss it with me. It was not from want of conveniencing me. There was the most complete love and confidence between us, but it was out of his desire to keep all alarm away from me. He thought I should brood over it if I knew all, so he was silent.
How did you know it, then? Mrs. Douglas's face lit with a quick smile.
Can a husband ever carry about a secret all his life, and a woman who loves him have no suspicion of it? I knew it in many ways. I knew it by his refusal to talk of some episodes of his American life. I knew it by certain precautions he took. I knew it by certain words that he let fall. I knew it by the way he looked at unexpected strangers. It was perfectly certain that he had some powerful enemies, that he believed they were on his track, and that he was always on his guard against them. I was so sure of it that for years I have been terrified if he ever came home later than was expected.
I might ask, said Holmes, what were the words which attracted some of your attention?
The Valley of Fear,
The lady answered.
that was an expression he has used when I questioned him. I have been to the Valley of Fear, and I'm not out of it yet. Are we ever to get out of this Valley of Fear? I have asked him when I can see him more serious than usual. Sometimes I think that we never shall, he has answered.
Surely you have asked him what he meant by the Valley of Fear.
I did, but his face would become very grave, and he would shake his head. It is bad enough that one of us should have been in its shadow, he said. Please God, it shall never fall upon you. It was some real valley in which he had lived, and something terrible had occurred to him. Of that I am certain, but I can tell you no more.
And he never mentioned my name, any other names.
Yes, he was delirious with fever once when he was hunting an accident 3 years ago. Then I remember that there was a name that came continually to his lips. He spoke it with anger and a sort of horror. McGinty was the name. Bodymaster McGinty. I asked him when he was recovered who Bodymaster McGinty was, and his whole body he was master of. Never mind, thank God, he answered with a laugh, and that was all I could get out of him. But there is a connection between the Bodymaster McGinty and the Valley of Fear.
There is one other point, said Inspector MacDonald. You met Mr. Douglas in a boarding house in London, did you not? And became engaged to him there. Was there any romance, any secret so mysterious about the wedding?
Oh, there was romance. There is always romance. There was nothing mysterious.
You had no rival.
No, I was quite free.
You have heard, no doubt, that this wedding ring has been taken. Does that suggest anything to you? Suppose that some enemy of his old life had tracked him down and committed this crime. What possible reason could he have for taking his wedding ring? There was an instant I could have sworn that the faintest shadow of a smile flickered over the woman's lips.
I really cannot tell,
She answered.
It is certainly a most extraordinary thing.
Well, we will not detain you any longer, and we are very sorry to put you in all this trouble all this time, said the inspector. There are other points, no doubt, but we can refer to you as they arise. She rose, and I was again conscious of that quick, questioning glance with which she had just surveyed us.
What impression has then my evidence made over you?
The question might as well have been spoken. Then with a bow she swept from the room. She is a beautiful woman. A very beautiful woman, said MacDonald thoughtfully, after the door had closed behind her. This man Barker has certainly been down here a good deal. He is a man who might be attractive to a woman. He admits that the dead man was jealous, and maybe he knew best himself what cause he had for jealousy. Then there's that wedding ring. You can't get past that. The man who tears the wedding ring off a dead man's... What did you say to it, Mr. Holmes? My friend sat with his head upon his hands, sunk in the deepest thought. Now he rose and rang the bell. Ames, he said when the butler entered, where is Mr. Cecil Barker now? I'll see, sir. He came back with a moment to say that Mr. Barker was in the garden. Can you remember, Ames, what Mr. Barker had upon his feet last night when you joined him in the study? Oh, yes, Mr. Holmes. He had a pair of bedroom slippers. I brought him his boots when we went to the police. Where are the slippers now? They're still under the chair in the hall. Very good, Ames. It is, of course, important for us to know which tracks may be Mr. Barker's and which from outside. Yes, sir. I may say that I noticed that the slippers were stained with blood. So indeed were my own. Well, that is natural enough, considering the condition of the room. Very good, Ames. We will ring if we want you. A few minutes later, we were in the study. Holmes had brought with him the carpet slippers from the hall. As Ames had observed, both soles were dark with blood. Strange, murmured Holmes as he stood in the light of the window and studied them minutely. Very strange indeed. Stooping with one of his quick feline pounces, he placed the slipper upon the blood mark on the sill. It exactly corresponded. He smiled in silence at his colleagues. The inspector was transfigured with excitement. His native accent rattled like a stick upon railings. Man, he said, there's no doubt of it. Barker just marked the window himself. It's a good deal broader than in the boot mark. I mind you that it was a splay foot, and there's the explanation. But what's the game, Mr. Holmes? What's the game? Ah, what's the game? My friend repeated thoughtfully. White Mason chuckled and rubbed his fat hands together in his professional satisfaction. I said it was a snorter, he cried, and a real snorter it is.